Hello from Jyväskylä, Finland, and welcome to our First Beat Sports webinar, monitoring adaptations using heart rate responses to submaximal exercise, part 2, with Martin Buchheit, Shaun McLaren, and Tzlil Shushan back here as our experts. Most of you attended the session, the first part, 2 weeks ago, but if you missed it, be sure to check out the recording afterwards because it has a lot of really valuable background on the topic. I'm Tiina Hoffman, exercise physiologist at First Beat, and I'll just very shortly get things started here before letting the guys run the show today. This webinar will last 1 hour, and we will be recording it, and you'll get the recording in our thank you email afterwards. The Q&A box is open throughout the webinar, so you can write questions in there, and the guys actually will answer some of the questions already during the webinar, or they'll pick them up in the end if we have time. But in any case, we'll email all the written questions and answers to you afterwards. So if you want to just focus on listening to these experts today, they're really good presenters, you can do that, and you'll still catch up with the questions and answers afterwards. If you are brand new to First Beat, just a couple of words about us. I encourage you to go to our website because there is a lot of information and background about our scientific roots and different solutions that we use. But we have over 1,000 professional teams around the world in all the major leagues who are using the First Beat Sports solution. And our specialty is to provide physiological solutions to improve performance in team sports. Our physiological platform recently added a submaximal testing feature, and so that is very appropriate considering the topic of this webinar series, and you can actually test it also with the First Beat Sports solution. But at this, I'm going to give the floor to our team of experts. So welcome back, Martin, Shaun, and Tzlil, and we can get started.
Awesome. Thanks for the intro, and super happy to be back with the First Beat team, our team with Tzlil and Shaun, and all the attendees to the webinar. So pretty excited to now dive into this second part. So while I'm sharing my screen, I'm gonna go through maybe very quickly how everything kind of started and a bit the base of what we presented last time. So I'm sure you guys are aware of this paper that we released, I would say soon, a month ago now. Which is really a large review, more a narrative review of all the work that has been done in the space with a bunch of pretty excited researchers, but more importantly, practitioners that have been part of the project. So before we dive into part 2, I'll go through a quick recap of part 1, going through the main points that we've been through last time. So we discussed a bit about the history, about the test, how we started, and why submaximal testing is important. And I think most importantly, we started to say that we didn't invent the wheel, and you had some studies back in the mid-90s where people were already using a lot submaximal testing. So it's nothing new. It's really grounded into simple physiology, but we definitely applied it to the team sport context, and we dive into the practicalities of it. We spent a bit of time on which heart rate deriving this we should use. You know, people are using heart rate recovery, heart rate exercise, of course, but also heart rate variability some stage. And we kind of made it clear that if we wanted to use one of the most sensitive, reliable, but also be pragmatic and save time, just using often the last minute of exercise is probably enough, and doing more analysis just takes more time. So on a pragmatic approach of the things, heart rate exercise is probably the go-to metrics to monitor. Then we went through the different protocols, and mainly we spent time on the standardized run that are the most used and the first level of entry when it comes to monitoring heart rate. So we went through the different protocols. Most of the time, it's a 4-5 minutes, 3 to 4 minutes run. We discussed the different speeds, the different setup. Shaun and Tzlil shared how they implement it in AFL, in football, in rugby. They run around an oval. Shaun does shuttles. In my context, I've been implementing kind of an A-shaped type of run, but basically it's the same. As long as you have a protocol you're happy with that fit in your context, what matters most is the consistency when it comes to the setup and the speed and so on. And today we're going to dive actually more into the other protocols about stuff that are less controlled and the sport-specific action. So that's going to be a big part of part 2. We talked about the evidence of the validity of a heart rate exercise and also what it actually measures. It's basically around generic cardiovascular fitness. And when we go through all the studies that have looked at the correlation between the changes in maximal heart rate and the changes in, for example, VO2 max or maximal aerobic speed mainly, the correlation, depending on the studies, they already range around 0.7, which shows that there is an important shared variance, but it's not perfect. It's never perfect because, as we discuss after, heart rate exercise is not capturing everything, and mainly it's not capturing anything related to the neuromuscular system. So that just shows that's why the correlations are not perfect, because you might improve your metabolic system, but not the neuromuscular system at the same extent. And this is why there's always a trend, a tendency, but we're not explaining the overall performance perfectly. And that's why also we consider, or we recommend, using other measures alongside, not monitoring only the adaptation on the metabolic side, but also monitoring the adaptation or the responses on the neuromuscular side that is not captured by exercise heart rates. We spent a bit of time about measuring fatigue, yes or no, with the heart rate exercise. And this is when things get a bit more complex, because there's a lot of context that is behind that to explain those changes. And as I was saying before, we need to pair those measures with on one side the muscular system assessment, but also with perceptual response measures such as wellness or RPE for the same exercise intensity, for example, because we see that those changes happen independent of those other variables. And there's a lot of consideration around also the comforting factors, such as when you train in the heat, when you are just finishing an intense period of training, for example, or days off. All those factors affect directly plasma volume, which obviously impacts directly exercise heart rate, because we know if we think about cardiac output, we have to think about the heart rate, but also the plasma, the stroke volume that is directly affected by the plasma volume. So there's lots to consider when we interpret the changes. We're going to dive again into more details about how to interpret changes, but the plasma volume bit is pretty important, and we need to consider. And we also shared some strategies how to best try to standardize when there are some changes in environment temperature, for example. So hopefully that just does a quick, very quick summary of what we covered in part 1. And I'll now move to today's menu. We're going to go through today, and we're going to start with some discussion around the scheduling of the test within the week. And we might actually open a poll right now to figure out how, at the moment, it's an open question to the audience of when do you guys feel it's more appropriate, either based on your current experience, if you're already using the test, or what sounds optimal or in theoretical optimal for you guys if you are now thinking about implementing it in the week. So we're going to discuss about that. We're going to also discuss today, and that's probably one of the most important aspects of today, is to understand how we can interpret the changes and make decision, whether it is understanding the rationale of these changes that we already mentioned a little bit, but also understanding the statistical aspect of it, and understanding when a change is actually meaningful and when we can trust those changes. So that's an important aspect of it. We're going to stress on the need to have also some concomitant absolute fitness measurement, because everything we measure with exercise heart rate is rather relative changes. So we're going to make the dissociation between that. And interestingly, we're going to finish off with some case studies at the team level, at the individual level, and then we'll move on to close the day to the more specific content and context with all the great work, especially that Tzlil has done more recently. Passing drills, control small-sided games, back in the stuff we were doing in PSG as well, and also the predictive model. So we get into that, and hopefully we'll manage to wrap everything up within the hour and also trying to answer a question along the chat, but also at the end if it's required. So let's go now, starting about the scheduling, and I'm going to hand over now to my colleagues. So I'll let you, I'm just going to mute myself and let you hand over, and also maybe comment the poll so far.
Yeah, so I'm just looking at the results of the poll here, Martin, and we've got almost 3/4 of people said that they would schedule a submaximal fitness test early in the week, match day +2 or match day -3. I guess that's, you think about that logically, you want to kind of clear any fatigue from the game, and you want to do it potentially furthest away from the game as possible to not interfere with game preparation. We've also got probably about coming up to 1/3 of people who said middle of the week, so match day -2 or -3. And we only had one person that said that they would do it match day -1, which to me, match day -1 would have always been something that, why would we do a test on match day -1? But actually, more recent thoughts I've had, I'm starting to think it might not be a bad idea, and we'll maybe have a look later in the webinar as to how you can secretly embed a submax on match day -1 and almost test players without knowing that they're being tested. But we've got a couple of rules, I guess, for recommendations for scheduling. I'll give an overview of what we think rule 1 and rule 2 are, and then I'll hand over to Tzlil about kind of the practicality. So the first kind of rule for scheduling a submaximal test within the microcycle is just be consistent. We can argue about whether we should do it before or after heavy days, before or after doing it for rest, but the most important thing is that we're not changing this around. It would be maybe not make sense from a physiological perspective if the camera's just popped itself off there, sorry. It would possibly not make sense from a physiological perspective if we scheduled it on 1 week, match day -2, and we did this in an evening training session or a late afternoon training session, and then the next week or the next test we were testing match day +2, and it was in the morning session. So we want to avoid anything that can influence heart rate other than the actual presence or absence of fitness and the state of cardio fitness, which is what we're trying to assess. So we're trying to mitigate fluctuations in load, we're trying to mitigate fluctuations in circadian rhythm and things like that as well. And that kind of leads on to rule 2 as well, which is you probably, it makes sense to run a submax test after a couple of days of rest, and that totally negates the issue of load. So if we always run a submax test after a rest day or after 2 days of rest, then we're coming into that test in the same physiological state, in theory, every time. The issue here is changes in plasma volume. So when athletes rest, their plasma volume will reduce, and as a result, when they initiate exercise again, they may have a higher exercise heart rate response because the plasma volume hasn't reset. With at least 1 day of light training, we can potentially hang our hat on the fact that we're not going to be fatigued, but we've almost had this reset on plasma volume. We've almost had that initial kind of early flush out. So in an ideal situation, and it's never always ideal, we would have a look at maybe match day, 1 or 2 days rest, and then a light on-feet recovery type install day, and then the next day we would be testing the submax on the morning. Tzlil, do you just want to talk about some of the practicalities of that as well?
Yeah, I think I can share from my own experience. I've used to work with teams that we usually used to train or / recover on match day +1, and then we used to have our day off on match day +2. So the most feasible way for us was to schedule it on match day +3 after day of recovery. And I think in general, it worked quite well for us. I think rule number 1 is probably the most important one to follow, that if you keep it consistent, so the most important thing is probably to keep it consistent within the microcycle in order to repeat it. And if it works in your context, that you can do it following 1 day of training, and probably after you come into the week and you do it afterwards, it might be even better. But first of all, rule number 1, and then you can think following up with what you can do with it.
Maybe I'll comment on my views of having it on the -3 in the context of football. Is that, as Shaun was going through, for me it's important that we have some activity the day before, especially working with the top elite clubs. People would even travel for a day off, so you get flights, this kind of stuff. So I always found it a bit messy if you don't have this training day before. But the -3 works well because the -3 is often an extensive training day where we're looking for volume. So adding 800 meters or 1 kilometer of running on that day works with the topic, the orientation of the day, rather than +3, -4 is often more intensive, small spaces, accel, decels. So I would struggle more to sell that as a warm-up as a coach on an intensive rather than an extensive day. But that's another angle to answer. But again, back to rule 1 as the most important. All right, so I'll accelerate to the next slide about now talking about error of measurement. So I'll let Tzlil to start with commenting on those graphs.
Yeah, no problem. So I think one thing that we need to remember is probably the measurement properties of submaximal testing. And I think one great thing that submaximal testing or exercise heart rate is quite reliable. So in our previous meta-analysis, we found that the typical error of exercise heart rate, or the expected natural variation from test to retest, is about 1.6 percentage points. So basically, in simple terms, this means that if exercise heart rate changes by less than about 1.5 percentage points, it's probably a normal day-to-day variability rather than a meaningful physiological change. And another thing to consider here is the prediction intervals, which essentially provide us kind of the expected range of typical error values that we may see in future practices. And in our analysis, we found that this range is between 0.9 to 3 percentage points. So while the exact typical error value may vary slightly across different contexts, it still remains within quite narrow or acceptable range, if you want. So for example, in my own practice, we've seen values that are going towards the lower range of this range. And finally, when we also look on potential moderators, including prescription variables like duration, intensity, or even athlete demographics, the magnitude of this number didn't change. So I think the main track applications here will be that if your protocol includes different duration or intensities, for instance, the typical error stay quite reasonably stable in that regard.
And just to kind of jump in on that, we're effectively talking about an outcome measure here that it's highly reliable, and even when you put it under the microscope and try and make it not reliable, because it can't be that good, right? It seems to hold up. So to kind of touch on something that we mentioned last week about, we get a lot of questions saying, what is the submaximal protocol for heart rate? And we said there isn't one. There's just some simple rules to follow, and this is one of the major reasons why. Because as long as, for example, your exercise intensity produces a heart rate between 70 and 90%, it doesn't really matter where you fluctuate. Because if you, for example, change exercise intensity by give or take 5 percentage points, the reliability of the test only changes by 0.01 or even less. So it's incredibly robust. And then that also means is that we can interpret changes with a little bit more confidence. So with a typical error of give or take 1.6 percentage points, using sort of an 80% level, we can say that the minimum detectable change in heart rate is around about 3 percentage points. And in real simple terms, how we'd report that back to coaches is we would say, what we're looking here for as a start, as a base, is a change of 3%. Anything less than that, we think it's just noise. We don't shout about it. It could be because of multiple different things, but we can't say one way or the other whether it's really a change in fitness or not. We only start paying attention to changes that are bigger than 3%. And at that point, then we'll have a look to go, is that change meaningful or not? Which probably brings us on to our next slide, Martin, unless you had anything to add into this one.
Yes. Just as a teaser to the next slide, I think this is very important to understand this difference between assessing a change that is, let's say, real in terms of noise. That's what you said, those 3%. But then we have to translate that into how meaningful it is, because that's something that people, especially if you use the classical statistics, people don't make the difference between what is, in one side, significant or mechanically clear versus what is substantial in terms of outcomes. And this is where we have to understand that it's not only about the noise, but also the signal. And in this case, I'll bring you back to this slide that we already presented when we were looking at the correlation between changes. And I guess, I'll let you finish this one. But I think very important to understand that it's not only about noise.
Yeah. So again, two separate things we're talking about here. Is the change real? As in, has there been an actual perturbation in physiology? And then a separate question is the real change actually meaningful in practice or what we see on the pitch and when we're working with athletes? So again, as previous, we use the typical error to look at are changes real or not. Minimum detectable change, about 3%. Okay, great. When we're seeing changes above 3%, how do we then interpret them? And one of the ways that we've had a look at this is this almost, we would call this like an anchor-based approach to the minimum practically important difference. And from all of these great studies here, so you've got Martin's study with the Aspire guys on top left. We have a Tzlil study on the right-hand side, and this was with a male football team down in Sydney when they had the treadmill-based MAS test. And then bottom left, we have Lachie McKenzie, who I know is on the call today. Big shout out to Lachie. And this was in collaboration with Tzlil on senior female soccer players. Again, that was the Flames over in Australia. And what we're seeing here is, I'm just reiterating what we went through in the previous webinar. Roughly, there or thereabouts, when athletes are dropping their heart rate in a submax test by 4 to 5 percentage points, their maximum aerobic speed is increasing by about 0.5 kilometre an hour. And that is regardless of whether it's senior or youth, male or female, whether it's a continuous submax or whether it's a shuttle submax, whether it's run at 13 or 11 kilometers an hour, and whether the assessment of max aerobic speed is something like the VAM eval, a time trial based estimate of mass, or actually measuring MAS on the treadmill with gas analysis gold standard. So we can roughly say here, and this is like where this comes back to the real world, because we've gone quite deep in the rabbit hole now, right? So we've got to bring it back. What we're talking to coaches and players about is when we're seeing real changes, a drop-off in your exercise heart rate that we know is a true drop-off of about 4 to 5%, we think that your max aerobic speed would improve by 0.5 kilometre an hour. And the even more practical bit about that is that why 0.5 kilometre an hour? Well, if we're doing the VAM eval, that's 1 level improvement. If we're doing the 30-15 IFT, that's 1 level improvement. If we're doing the yo-yo intermittent shuttle test, recovery level 1, 0.5 kilometre an hour is the difference between 1 shuttle stage. So from 18 point whatever to 19 point whatever, the difference in running speed is about 0.5 kilometre an hour. So yes, what we can't say is that 0.5 kilometre an hour will mean that you are a better footballer on the pitch or that you're going to outsprint a wing back when you make a break. But what we can say is that it represents a meaningful improvement in these established maximal tests that we use and that we make decisions from. So to kind of tie all that together, we came up with a little bit of a framework sort of based on magnitude-based decisions and inference. Martin, should we go to the next slide and have a look at the table? Basically tying all this together. We say changes in exercise heart rate based on a known typical error of 1.6 and a probable minimum practically important change of about 4 to 5%. When you combine all this together in a decision-based framework, if you see a change that's less than 3%, it's not actionable. It's likely noise. You can't say either way. If you see a change that's between 3 and 6%, there's definitely been a true physiological change, but we don't know for certain that it is above that, clearly above that threshold of 4 or 5%. When we're seeing changes of 6% and more, we know that there's been a real change in physiology, and worst case scenario, it's more than likely cleared that 4 to 5% threshold. So here's where we start to make decisions from that, whether we're evaluating the effect of a pre-season, a running-based return to play, or looking at changes from the start to the end of the season to have a look at who needs what when we try and manage and navigate players through that end season phase.
Excellent. Yeah, thanks for the detailed explanation. And as I said, that's to me more than important to understand the magnitude of those changes to really make the decisions. And this is going to lead us to this nice also kind of case study that I'll let you comment as well, Tzlil, where we can see how we can use that in practice.
Yeah. So I think that's the time that we bring it into practice and show some case studies. So I think we've already discussed that one of the strengths of submaximal testing is the ability to assess the athlete more repeatedly and to build up greater number of observations over time. And so we've basically discussed on this typical error for quite a bit now. But one important thing to say here also that this error usually decreases a bit more as we collect more and more data points. So statistically, the typical error reduces by the square root of the number of observations, which basically mean that the more the data we collect, the estimate become a little bit more precise. So to illustrate this in practice, so this is data from a preseason in female football players, where we conducted the submaximal test weekly. And Shaun, you've mentioned Lockie McKenzie, so this is part of his work, so kudos for him, and he's on this call as well. And on the left side, you can basically see the individual player plots with the preseason week on the x-axis and the observed exercise heart rate on the y-axis. And the orange point, which hopefully you can see them alongside there, basically represent the observed exercise heart rate in each individual test. And the blue line show the trend over time. And the blue line is basically estimated using a linear regression model. So here, instead of basically just relying on the pre and post data point, the preseason and post-preseason, we estimate the slope or the change in exercise heart rate using or across multiple observations. And on the right side, you can see a summary of the overall change across the preseason. And the gray shaded area represents what we've said before, just like the trivial change, what we consider a trivial change in both directions. And in that case, we've considered it as plus and minus 4% points in that case. And basically what you can see, that you can see all the individual players, that basically all of them reduced exercise heart rate across the preseason. But another thing that you can see, that some of them, like player 19, for example, showed a larger decrease compared to player 13 or player 7. And the way that we interpret this data is by looking on the slope or the point estimate that you can see there and those confidence interval around it in relation to the gray area. And if it falls outside or mostly outside that zone, this is where we might interpret this as meaningful changes across the training phase. So again, this is one example of how we can use utilize repeated measures to inform decision making. And I think another important point to consider here is that because we do the tests weekly, we can have more kind of real-time decision making that we can reflect on and see how it goes across the preseason and whether we need to change anything for those players that are not showing the trends that we expect to see.
I think just to chip in a little bit on that one, Tzlil, if you don't mind. First of all, kudos to Lockie and yourself, because I'm looking at this and I'm like, great, no one got worse and most people got better. And that's what you want, right? That's the proof in the pudding. From my experience, we'll often see this drift in pre-season, even despite everybody might not necessarily improve on the maximal fitness test. And that's maybe linked to a lot of Martin's reasons that he mentioned. First of all, those things are highly motivation dependent. You only get one chance to do a max test. You've got to perform on the day. If you don't, it looks like you got worse, right? And a great point that you said there, this is the unique thing about submax testing. You get chance to have an early look at your preseason changes on the fly. You can look at who's trending in the right direction and by the right magnitude on week 3, 4, 5. You can make changes to the plan in week 3, 4, 5. You can't make changes to the plan in week 8 when preseason's done, and you have to get in the game. So this is super powerful, and like it's one of the most unique things about submax testing, and it changes the narrative, and it's a whole new paradigm of not only how we embed tests or how we test by embedding them into the training process, but how we analyze the data on the fly to make sure that we catch things early and we don't leave it too late like the traditional approach.
Yeah, it's the frequency, the capacity to test with high frequency that is also a game changer. Not only about the submax versus, well, it's related to the fact that it's submax, but yeah, the testing frequency is key. All right, so I'm going to try to take you now through probably not the most important, because a lot of the figures of the paper are important, but it's kind of really bringing everything together about, again, understanding those changes. So as you can see, there's a big column about context, because the context matters more than anything as often, and is really going to help us to understand whether the implications are actually positive, beneficial, or negative on that side. So let's start with how to interpret increases in heart rate. And I'm making sure now that we only discuss changes that are above this 6% threshold, so that we're only discussing those clear and substantial changes. So what happens, or how can we interpret a positive or whether it's a negative change based on those changes. So substantial increase in heart rate in the context of more a long-term, so there's a trend, exactly as we were just looking at seeing on the previous slide, there's a trend of a positive increase in heart rate. The subjective scores are normal, the chronic load is normal. That's definitely likely a decrease in fitness. So that would be the first way to interpret that. But now, what happened if we also see an increase in heart rate, but in this case, we see a worsening of subjective scores, and this is just following a high acute training load? This is definitely possible. What is really possible is that we have an acute fatigue state. So in this case, it's likely that the neuromuscular system is tired, so you get a worsening in running economy, and for that reason, heart rate increases. So again, as you see, on both cases, we have an increase in heart rate, but for different reasons, we can now start to interpret and think about the outcomes. On one side, with a stable chronic load and normal subjective score is definitely a metabolic negative response, while on the second aspect, it's more a neuromuscular, let's say, issue that fatigue develops. Now, in this case, if we have a spike, just 1 week, just an acute spike in heart rate, that is still substantial, but we have normal subjective score, the player was wasted the day before, dehydrated or had caffeine, you get the idea. It's probably not a proper trend, and it's likely related to probably changes in plasma volume or the effect of caffeine, this kind of stuff that creates an acute, a transient increase in heart rate, while this is unlikely to be reflecting a proper substantial change in fitness. So that will probably something we will need to retest to confirm the trend before we get to make a proper decision. So we'll have exactly the same, let's say, approach in the blue, in the case. Now to the second last boxes, when there's a drop, long-term drops, as we were seeing before with the case of the preseason, normal subjective scores, stable chronic load. This is definitely what we are all looking for. That's a proper increased cardiovascular fitness in a normal context. So the blue boxes are what we're all looking for in a preseason context, for example. Now, and also we discussed that a little bit. We were kind of also discussing a study from Jan Lemmer, where we can also see long-term trends of decreased heart rate. But in the case, in this time of a worsening subjective scores, high chronic load, in this case, we have actually an opposite response. And that might be actually reflective of an overreaching and chronic fatigue. So again, same trends, a proper, clear, substantial decreases of heart rate, but in one side, blue box reflecting increased fitness, pink box that is related to worsening of subjective scores, likely chronic fatigue. So hopefully with this decision tree, you can now start to have an understanding of how to best interpret the changes. But as you see, without the context, we don't go very far, and it's very easy to actually make the wrong decision. So the context, as always, matters a lot. I think now it's time to transition to case studies, and maybe I'll let Shaun comment on this nice Indian case study from our collaboration with Stefan Altman and the guys in Germany.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to present this figure here. Stefan was part of our larger paper, and this is two separate pieces of research that the guys did. On the left-hand side, what you're seeing is professional German footballers that range from the Bundesliga to the German 4th division. There was over 225 tests here where a submaximal fitness test was performed on the same day as a treadmill-based lactate test. On the right-hand side, you're seeing the exact research design, but that was in youth German footballers, and there was 170 test comparisons here. So in terms of how many times there was a test performed where a submax was done and then a treadmill test was done to determine lactate threshold, we're looking at over 500 tests here. So there's some pretty good proof in the pudding. I love these figures by Stefan because they tell you so many things. At a simple overview level, this is how you would track submax over time. At a second level, this is further evidence for the validity of submax, because if you have a look at the changes in exercise heart rate, which is the pink dots and line, And then if you have a look at the changes in blood lactate, which is the blue dots and line, you can see that they kind of follow the same pattern, especially in the seniors on the left-hand side, where we have these perturbations between sort of mid-2013 going all the way through to 2017. So we're not talking about a quick 8-week study here. We're talking over half a decade's worth of test and retest. And you can see that the lines are almost pretty much following the same pattern. Interesting, what the guys did here is, based on the approaches that we've discussed previously, you can ultimately use your stats to get to a decision and say, did the player improve fitness or not? And we've now got that for 2 measures. We've got it for exercise heart rate on the submax, and we've also got it for second lactate threshold on the treadmill, using typical error, minimum smallest worthwhile change, or minimum practically important difference. And in the study here, in both studies, so you've got the original and the replication, seniors and in youth, there was about a 2/3 complete match, where the submax test said there has or hasn't been an improvement in fitness, and where the lactate test said the exact same. About a third of the time, it was one said that there was an improvement or a reduction in fitness, and the other said that there was no change. So one said yes change, the other said no change. There was only about, I think it's less than a 3% or a 1 to 3% time across all of these 500 tests where one test said there's been an improvement in fitness and the other test said there has been a reduction in fitness. So that's a complete mismatch. So 2/3 of the time, they tell you the same thing. A third of the time, one test can't make its mind up and the other one's a little bit more clear about the direction. And less than 1 to 3% of the time, they're telling you different information. And you can kind of see that in the seniors around about 2012, 2013, where we're getting these disparate changes. One goes one direction, one goes the other. But that's why I love this as a case study. And big shout out to Stefan and everyone that was involved with the 2 pieces of original work here.
Yeah, definitely. I'm going to take you now to another case study with an individual player that I had the chance to work with back in my time with Lille. And well, you get the same story, you get the same idea. And also, I think we are kind of reinforcing the way we suggest to present the data. You know, you had that in the graph before. You always had this gray area that represents the non-substantial changes. So that's within the band, the plus minus 4 or 5. And then every time you have a measurement of a 1 heart rate dot, you always have those error bars that obviously represent the typical error. So it's a very easy way to visually see where the dots lie. So back to this case study, that's players, as you see, was assessed many times throughout the season. There are periods of the time of the season for various reasons he was not assessed. That definitely, that's the preseason where the player was not with us, and at some stage you see it. So there's always, that's the real life, you know, you cannot always do week to week. Sometimes you have a game midweek and you can't do it and so on. So that's, but anyway, the importance is to look at what was his average baseline. You can see that he was a tendency to be a bit fitter at the start of the second season, where his heart rate was the lowest. And then unfortunately in March, in this case, in March 23, he got an ACL rupture. The first time he was back on running after 4 or 5 months, as you can see, the first time that he was back on the pitch and he was able to run at 12 km per hour, this is also the good things of that, is that you can have a large historical data. And at this time, the player was obviously not be able to, because of the injury, he was not able to run maximal, but we could still have some information about his genetic fitness at this stage. And as you can see, the first time he's able to run, his heart rate is not too far off the normal zone that he was before getting injured. And then you see how week after week, with the return to the field and the return to the sport specific phase, he progressively, continuously improved his fitness and ended up, as the moment he returned to compete, to have very, very low heart rates, which were close to the best time of his short career with us, when he was super fit at the end of the preseason. So that's an example of how quickly we can test in the rehab stage. We don't have to wait for the player to be able to run maximally, and also how we can track the improvement. And of note as well, that's also part of this figure, you can see that where the player was expected to be, if we look at the literature data, where it's kind of a bit of a complex analysis of the back of that, but we were looking at the detraining the normal detraining trend when it comes to changes in VO2 max that we translated into maximal peak speed and then translating into changes in heart rate based on the figure we saw before. But I would say you can expect up to an increase by about 10% in heart rate after an ACL based on the literature response to a submax. And in this case, the player had only 3-4% worsening in his heart rate at submax, showing as well that we probably have done a good job with all the off-field and more indoor type of cycling exercise, which is also something that we can also monitor when we're talking about using mainly runs outside. But of course, we could have also presented the submax response to the bike that he's been doing throughout the rehab, but that's for another day as well. So I think now it's important that we transition to what we call the V2 and the V3 aspect of using a submax heart rate, using, in this case, different types of less standardized but more sport-specific drills. And that's where Tzlil has done a great work. So I'll let him explain us a little bit on the topic.
Cool. Thanks, Martin. So yeah, as Martin says, so here we're now shifting a bit more and looking on V2 and V3 approaching, and this is using intermittent variable submaximal protocols that are actually embedded or to the main training session. So in this study, what we wanted to do is basically to explore whether we could obtain similar insight for monitoring player doing controlled submaximal protocol compared to a more standardized sport-specific drill. And in this case, it was kind of a Y-shaped passing drill. So basically here we ran both protocols within the same training session over a 12-week period, which gave us an opportunity to complete 2 protocols on 8 different occasions. And just to give a quick overview how it works in practice. So we had roughly 15 minutes from the beginning of the session, which included a short warm-up with the players, then a 3-minute submaximal shuttle run, and that's the setup that you can see on the left side of the slide. Then we had a few minutes for water or recovery, and this basically followed by the passing drill, which you can see on the right side of the slide. And if you look at the bottom, the blue lines represent the speed, and you can see how it stays fairly consistent throughout the shuttle run test, but fluctuates much more during the passing drill. And the pink lines show the heart rate responses in both protocols. Unless you have something to add here, Martin, or Shaun, if you want to release the poll now before the results, I don't know what will be the best. What do you think will be the best option?
I'll do that, yeah. If you can carry on and I'll get that poll released.
Okay, so Martin will go next slide. Is that okay? Okay, so this is quite busy slide. So let's focus on the most important finding, and I'll try to do my best here. So the first thing that we found is a fairly large relationship between the observed exercise heart rate responses from the shuttle run test and the passing drill. And this was around 0.6 out of 0.6. And you can see it on panel A in the figure. However, when we fitted the model that accounted for the variability in external training load across repeated observation in the passing drill, and in that case, we found that the total distance and high-speed running distance were the strongest predictors, the relationship became even stronger, about R equal 0.8. And this is, you can see it a little bit tighter in panel B. So just in simple terms, what the model allowed us to do is to basically generate what we call adjusted exercise heart rate values that are essentially values that considering a control external training load across the passing drill. And when we compare these adjusted exercise heart rate responses to the observed values in the shuttle run test, the relationship was meaningfully stronger. And another key finding that we've kind of found that after adjusting for exercise heart rate to those locomotor outputs in the drill, the root mean square error, which essentially is an estimate that provides the difference between the observed and the predicted values across the 2 protocols, decreases from 2.2 to 1.6% points. And you can see it on the table on panel D on the right side. So as you might remember, 1.6% point is the typical error of exercise heart rate when comparing between two identical submaximal tests. But so now, even when comparing between two different protocols, once we account for external training load in the drill, the level of agreement between the two protocols become almost identical to what we'd expect, where we're simply running exactly the same protocol. So just to summarize here, because these analytical approaches sometimes look a bit challenging to understand on the spot. But basically, this finding promotes the idea that when we collect an adequate number of repeated measures from a generic protocol, like the shuttle run test, and a sport-specific protocol like the Y-shaped passing drill, we can later predict heart rate responses of one simply by conducting the other. And the good thing that this can offer kind of a time-efficient and also ecologically valid way to monitor the players using embedded drill that are in the training session and not kind of distinct or separated running protocols.
I think one of the cool things about this is by increasing the feasibility of the test and being able to do it and it not look, sound, or feel like a test, we're more likely to slip it in. And then almost like you're scheduling issues of, I mentioned a point earlier of like, why would you ever test someone on match day -1? And then when you think about it from like preparing players for the game and when we should ideally test a submax, we should have a bit of training under our belt. We shouldn't be fatigued. We should be quite fresh and ready to go. When does that happen in the microcycle? It's match day -1. That's what you gear up for. You've got all your loading in early in the week. You should be tapering and trying to be fresh for match day. Match day -1 might be the perfect time physiologically to run a submax. The idea of rolling out a running-based test is nonsensical and you won't get by it. Doing something like a Y-shaped passing drill, the same drill for 3 to 4 minutes every single day as part of your match day -1 prep, players and coaches like consistency, right? So this is an excellent way to get it in. And like we've seen from all the case studies, the more touch points, the more tests you can get, the better you're going to have an idea of those trends and changes. And in the study here, keep an eye out for this one. We're hoping to have it published real soon. We're on the second phase of review. There was some extra cool analysis we done. We show how to adjust for heart rate, and we showed that, you know, when you do adjust for heart rate in these tests, players that have the lower heart rate in the passing drill also have a higher VO2 max and also a higher max aerobic speed as measured on the treadmill.
And I think it comes in the next slide, probably.
Yeah, I think we're gonna go to version 3, aren't we, Martin? Just in the interest of time.
Yeah, easy.
Yes. Just a bit of a background on that. You know, that's probably exactly in the context you described, Shaun. We're back in our days in Paris with Mathieu Lacombe, Ben Simpson, of course. You know, we had no ability to implement the running test. So even though we believed in it, except pre-season, there was no way we could run because it was playing every three days. So we had to find a way, and that's when we worked on the V3 and trying to standardize a bit the drill. And that's the analysis that I'll let you go through, Shaun.
Yeah, again, so this was from Matthew's paper from the PSG study with Martin and the other guys. And effectively, what we're doing here is if we call Submax version 1 the standardized run, then if we call a standardized passing drill or a standardized small-sided game version 2, and version 2 means we analyze the data exactly how Tzlil just described. This is then version 3, where there's no element of standardization. We just let the players play small-sided games, large size, small size, lots of players, not a lot of players, with, without goalkeepers, quick reload of ball, no quick reload of ball, etc. So we just let training happen as it happens. And what we know that we can do in those situations is from certain parameters, mostly external training load measured via GPS and accelerometers, but also some contextual information, like when does the game happen in the session? There's a small-sided game at the beginning or the end? Based on those variables, we can pretty accurately predict a player's expected heart rate response in a small-sided game. You've got previous external training load, parameters about the game itself, maybe it's the pitch dimension, then you've got when does it happen in the session, etc. And you can get a pretty close prediction of what someone's heart rate might be. Then you go ahead and do the game, and you actually measure their heart rate. And the theory is here is, if I go do a small-sided game and I'm predicted, based on the parameters of the game, I should get an exercise heart rate in that game of 82% of maximum. If I'm then scoring in 88%, I've got a 6% point difference, a HRD, a heart rate difference. And that's the units of measurement you're seeing on the screen right now. And in theory, if I'm predicted to be low 80s, but I'm scoring in at high 80s, could we say that I'm potentially not fit, or maybe I'm fatigued? Or again, based on all my previous small-sided game data, if I'm predicted to score in mid-80s and I'm coming in high 70s, you might say, wow, Shaun's really fresh today, or maybe he's actually developed fitness based on his former self. And that was exactly what the guys did here in this study. There was a lot more analysis that we might not have time to show, but the proof in the pudding about that index, the difference between predicted and actual heart rate, is here, because that index drops off, it reduces throughout pre-season. So again, a reduction in the index could potentially indicate you're gaining fitness. And this is a targeted training period, pre-season, where we're trying to improve fitness. So it's kind of validity via a known difference. If it's a valid index, we should expect it to drop off with targeted training. And that's exactly what the guys saw here in this study with the PSG players.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for getting into the detail. And shout out to Mathieu and then Mauro, who kind of pushed this further as well in Parma at the moment. And again, that all this data is in the overall paper. So that's definitely the most advanced approach. But we have to be honest as well and acknowledge that there's a lot of analytics off the back of that. So if you want to start and go easy, 4-minute run, just look at the heart rate. That's way easier. But if you want to go into the details, that's probably, and also, as you were saying, we can at some stage use both. And again, that's another level that we won't have time to go into the detail today, because of course what we're talking about now, those V3 are more specific, so they capture probably another level of the fitness of the players, while generic runs are probably more generic cardiovascular fitness and so on. And that was the concept we went through the paper. So I think it's time to wrap up, and I'm going to try to summarize briefly what we went through today. So when we discussed scheduling, we said the most important is to be consistent. We tend to favor midweek, and if it's possible, try to avoid to have a day off before, so that you are not inclined to have an effect of potential change in plasma volume or this kind of stuff. Interpreting the changes and making decision, we explained that we have to combine not only the noise of measurement, but also look for changes that are meaningful in terms of magnitude. And this is why looking for change that at least greater than 5 to 6% is probably required, so that we're capturing something that is really meaningful. Why do we need to also look at absolute fitness measurements? That was a bit the example when we went through the study with Stefan Altmann and the German players, where if we were just look at changes in heart rate, we could also say that in a relative way, at some stage, player got fitter or less fit, but we don't know where they started from. While if we now have an entry, which is a lactate test or a maximal test, we have an absolute value. And then we can, from this entry, say, okay, from this lactate, this submaximal or this V4 running speed at 12 or 14, from that, the player is increasing his fitness or is dropping fitness. So we need this to enter at some stage so that we can complement Submax. But at least we need once at the start of the season, and then everything can be relative with heart rate. Case studies, I think that really shows how individual the response is. When you look at the study that's still presented, you see those lines during preseason. Every single regression line has a different slope because every player adapts differently. And that's obviously the beauty of it, is that we can individualize our assessment of the responses. And we finished off by discussing the submaximal assessment translated into more specific. That was the standardized drill, what we call the V2, standardized passing drill, these kind of things. And the V3 is taking what we can, but having a way more depth into the analytics, so that we can control for more variables that can affect the heart rate response, whether it's a locomotor load, but also the time in the session and these kind of things. So as I said, it's completely invisible, but requires more analytics. And I think that's it. That's it for today. So I hope we we managed to debunk a little bit and to go into all the complexity of the paper. And hopefully this has been helpful for the listeners. And we have maybe a few minutes. If there's a few burning questions, let's try to answer them then.
Couple of questions, definitely time if you, Shaun and Tzlil and Martin, if you want to pick some out from there.
Well, we've had 4 this time. We were inundated last time, and there was smoke coming off my keyboard, and same for Tzlil. All the questions are going to get circulated, and if there is a way, possibly if anyone has questions after the fact, we'd love to hear from you. If not through Firstbeat, then just get in touch with us on LinkedIn, because again, we love this stuff and kind of brainstorming it and helping people. Tom has said, could the higher heart rate at the beginning of a season be explained by higher temperatures? Potentially. We discussed this in part 1, and from the work Martin and Tzlil have done, we're looking at about for every 1 degree increase in temperature in Celsius, it's also associated with about a 1 percentage point increase in heart rate. So the short answer is, unless you're going from extreme temperatures, and Martin gave a cool example from Miami to Paris, where there was about a 20 to 25 degree swing, potentially not. Is the 30-15 considered a submaximal test? It certainly is. Any maximal test, you just take the first 4 minutes and you're looking at the heart rate at the 4th minute when you stop. Dave Carolinas came in and said, when we're looking at small-sided games, could a player's heart rate drop off because of motivation, because some players are not trying as hard? So the practical example here is, yeah, absolutely. Players just got dropped. They've announced the team, by the way, let's go out and do this small-sided game. All of a sudden, this player isn't running around as much. If you're then doing your maximum test, maybe they jump out of the IFT on level 17 because they can't be bothered and they're just totally disengaged. In a small-sided game, if they're running around or less, their predicted heart rate would be lower. So the bottom line is, under the submax bonnet, which the predicted games are, you can't cheat the physiology still. And then last one that we've had here from Paul is, have we ever looked at heart rate recovery after a standardized submax test? Yeah, we covered this in part 1. Heart rate recovery, cool metric. In theory, should tell you a bit more about parasympathetic saturation. We find it doesn't give you any more information about fitness. It doesn't improve the prediction of something like a max test performance beyond what we're already getting from exercise heart rate. And based on everything we've now discussed in part 2, your goal of a submax is to make players and coaches not aware that you're even testing them at all. So to have them stand still for 1 or 2 minutes in the middle of a session, like a warm-up, it's potentially counterintuitive. You can do it. You might get some cool information from it. We prefer the practical approach.
Very well said.
I think there is only one more question very quickly. I think about the 30-15 and the 4 minutes. So I think it's quite important to differentiate between looking for cardiovascular status or physiology trends versus profiling for prescription. When we're thinking about prescription, like high-intensity interval training, this is where maximal tests become very important, because this will give us an estimate of how we go from here into the prescription part of things. But in order for monitoring cardiovascular responses, fitness or physiology in general, and how the status change over time, this is where submaximal fitness become very useful. I think, Martin, you've mentioned one thing, and it's also in the paper, that you've started to discuss changes in submaximal heart rate in relation to MAS. So if you see those changes and you communicate to the coaches as changes in MAS, which is a cool thing. I think something that we've started to think on is when we see those clear changes and we don't have the ability to test maximally, is it a good time to increase the HIIT prescription by 0.5 kilometers per hour, which I would say, yes, trial it. But we also know that there is quite of variability across these measures. And this is the time that you need to make your own coaching eye decisions about those changes.
Yep, completely agree. Very good. I think we've done with the questions, so probably time to wrap up, right?
Yeah, great. Really big thanks to you guys for your expertise and a lot of information. And thanks for the large group of listeners here. You'll get the email from us with the recording and also some of the questions and answers. And if you don't have the recording yet from the previous session and would like to listen to it, which is definitely a good idea, so then just reach out to us and we'll make sure you have access to the recording from the first session as well. But yeah, thanks guys for joining us and sharing your info, and thanks everyone, and we'll stay in touch. Have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
See you around. Cheers.